Okay, so today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia Kuf Yud Ches, Bava Metzia 118, and we're going to start at the Mishnah on the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis 117b. So the Mishnah says, and I'm going to turn my camera off so that I can, because I'm in the car, obviously, so I'm going to turn the camera off so I can better hold the Gemara, and you'll still be able to listen to everything I say. So the Gemara tells us on the bottom at the Mishnah on the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis as follows: V'chein beis abad. Let's say you have an olive press. Two brothers inherited an olive press. Shubanoi beis basela. The olive press is built under a rock. V'gina achas al gabav, and there's one garden on top of it. And nifchas, and the top of the rock came diminished. Bala gina yored v'zorei lamata. So then since the guy on top, the brother on top, he can't plant on the garden. What he has to do is he has the right to go and sow in the garden below inside the olive press. Yaza base bado, keep it until the person who has the olive press makes like a dome on top of it, and then he'll go back up. And so that second scenario of the Mishnah, let's you have a wall and a tree that fell into the public domain, and it damaged the public domain. Pater milashawan. Then under those circumstances, the person whose wall or tree fell is exempt from having to pay. Let's say the court gave him some time to cut down the tree, to break the wall, and it fell down within that amount of time. Potter, he's going to be exempt because it was unnoticed, but he had a grace period before having to cut it. After that amount of time, he's going to be responsible. He's liable. Let's say somebody's wall was next to the garden of his friend, and so then his wall falls into his friend's garden. And he says, listen, the guy who has the garden says to the guy whose wall fell down, get rid of your stones. And the guy who owns the garden, the guy who owns the wall, says to him, he says to him, listen, you can keep the stones. Ain't shomin lo. We don't listen to the owner of the wall. And so therefore, if the guy who has the garden doesn't want to keep the stones, the guy who has the wall has to get rid of them. But let's say the guy who has the garden decided to keep the stones, and now the owner of the wall says to him, I'll pay you for your moving expenses. I'll take back my stones. Ain't shomin. We don't listen to him anymore because he had already agreed to give the stones to the person. Next scenario: let's say you hire a worker, and you want this worker to collect the straw from your field. And the guy says, "Well, give me my money." And he says to him, "You know what? Take the work you did as a payment. Meaning, say, take your straw, and that'll be what I pay you." So he says, under those circumstances, ain't shilman. We don't listen to him. But let's say the guy accepted it, and then he said, and then he did accept the straw, and then the guy who was the employer said, okay, here I want to pay you, and I'll take my money. Ain't shilman. Then we don't listen to him anymore. We're going to have to explain why we need all these cases. So in the first case of where the stone roof fell down, nifchata, so we have a dispute which we had earlier, that if it just became a little bit broken, Rav says beruba, that once the majority of it broke, then we make the guy pay. And then we allow the guy to go down below, the guy on top, to plant his garden below. Shmuel says ba'arba. Shmuel says no. If once 4 tefachim have broken from the rock, we allow him to go down. Rav says beruba. Rav says the majority of it of ba'arba, but if it would just be 4, then adam zorei chatzil amatim chatzil amal. Then a person would sow half below and half above. Shmuel says ba'arba. Shmuel says with 4, because ein adam zorei chatzil amatim chatzil amal. A person doesn't sow half above and half below. So we see from here, Amar says this is really the same dispute we had earlier. With tzricha, we had the same case by a case of an apartment. So why do we have the same dispute by both an apartment and also by this case of the rock, where the guy has the olive press? The Gemara says we need both cases. Why? The iash me'inan dira Because if we had the case just only of the apartment, we would say Bahakam or Shmuel. That's where Shmuel says that it's 4 tefachim. Why? Mishum the law v'the inish to diary portach. Because Shmuel says it's not logical to say that a person is going to want to live half above and half below. So if he's going to have to move down to get to his table, we're not going to. He's not going to like that. So therefore, we allow him to move completely down below. But aval the inyan zriya, but with respect to sewing, then avida inchi the zari hacha porta. People will typically do this with respect to working. They'll work a little bit in one place, a little bit in another place. So therefore, if it's just 4 tefachim, then you can't move completely below. And so therefore, maybe he agrees with Rav, you need a majority. Even with Rav, you need a majority. And if you just had this case, then we would say in the case of the sewing, we would say Bahachkam Rav. If we just had the next case, if we just had basically the case of the olive press in the garden, we would say in that case, Rav says you need a majority. Avabaha, but in the case of a house, we would agree with Shmuel. Then even if it's 4 tefachim, we would say they gotta go out to move below. So tzricha, that's why we need both cases. So if the court gives him a period of time, how much time does the court have to give him? Nasne Usman, Kamazman, the Kamazman Bezdin. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shloshim Yom. Rabbi Yochanan says if the court gave him 30 days. So now if somebody had his wall and it fell down into the other person's courtyard, that was the scenario of the Mishnah, that if he has the wall and it fell down into his friend's garden, that the owner of the garden doesn't have to accept the stones. So, but if he accepted the stones, then the owner of the wall doesn't have the right to go back on it. So the Gemara says, Hamidiktani Seifa, but since the next part of the Mishnah tells us that if the owner says, Helech Yitziosecha, if the next part of the Mishnah says that if the owner of the wall says to the gardener, keep your stones, and I'll pay for them, and then the owner doesn't have to listen to them, then the owner of the garden doesn't have to go back on it. We call the paninu. We're talking about a case, the paninu askinan. We're talking about a case where the owner of the garden has removed the stones, and so then the owner of the wall can't go back on it. Taima de paninu. Why can the owner of the wall not go back? Only because the owner of the garden had actually moved the stones. Alo paninu, but if he hadn't actually moved them, then we would say he can't make this claim. But why not? Alo paninu lo amai v'tikno isadeo. Why does he have to actually move them to acquire them? Even if why don't we just say his field has automatically acquired them once there's the intent to acquire it? So the Gemara says, "The Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina Chatzer Shel Adam Kon." Why don't we say this? Didn't Rabbi Yossi say in the son of Rabbi Chanina that a courtyard of a person Konolo Shalomidaito, that his courtyard can acquire it even without his knowledge? The Gemara says more. That's only where he intends for it to acquire it. But in this case, but in this case, he doesn't really intend to give it over. The owner of the wall doesn't really intend to give it over to the owner of the courtyard. He was just trying to push him off and tell him to take the stone, but he wasn't genuinely trying to give it to him. Okay, we're on the next piece, which is in the middle of the page on 118a. So the Gemara says, let's say you hire a person to get rid of your straw, and then you say, I'll pay you with the straw. He doesn't have to accept the straw. He could say, I want the cash. So the Gemara says, and then the Gemara says, but we also have another case, which was the case we just said, that if basically the Gemara is wondering, isn't this the same case as the stones on the wall? The guy could say, no, I don't want your stones. You pay me for moving it. I don't want your stones. Pay me for moving the stones. So isn't this the same case as the guy who refuses to be paid with the straw? So why do we need both cases? So the Gemara says it's tzricha. If we just had the first case, the case of the stones on the wall, I would say that if he says, here, keep the stones, I don't want to pay you, you just keep the stones, he doesn't listen to him. Because in that case, the owner of the garden basically doesn't have any pre-existing agreement with the owner of the wall. Basically, he doesn't want them. He says, I don't want your stones. But avohacha the islay agragabe. But here he hired the worker, and so since he hired the workers, maybe we could say that he has the right to pay him with this because it's basically a debt. So therefore, he has a right to be paid. The Amri Yinshimi Mari Rishav Sech Pari Apara, meaning to say that we have an expression that if somebody owes you money, you can collect whatever you want, even brand. Meaning to say collect the money however you can. V'yashmin and Hacha, and if we had only the case of the hired worker, I would basically I would say Hacha Shemishakibo of Ain't Shomol. We say in this case that since the laborer, the person who was working, since he accepted the straw, ain't shomalo. We don't listen to the employer when it comes to take it back. But mishum the isli agro because he had an agreement with him, and so he took it, and so therefore the employer can't go back on it. But in the case of the wall, the way isli agro that they don't have a pre-existing relationship, so ema shomalo. Maybe we can listen to the employer when he says he wants his money back, and so therefore it's richa. So therefore we need both cases. So now the next case that the Gemara says goes back to the case of the Mishnah that if he tries to pay him in straw, the worker doesn't have to listen to the employer. So the Gemara says, well, Tanya, is that really the case? It doesn't have to listen, but we have a different price that says, Shomar that he can force him to take the straw. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman Kasha Kam B'Shalom Kam B'Shal Chavero. So when can you say our Mishnah, which says that the worker's allowed to be paid in cash? That's only in a case where he was working straight for the employer himself. But where is he forced to take the straw? That's where the worker was working for not the employer directly, but the employer's friend, basically, who's doing work for somebody else. So I'm really Rabbi Rav Nachman B'Shalom my time. If he's working directly for the employer, what's the reason why he's not forced to take the straw? The Amrei Agrolach, because he could say, you have to pay me. It's pay me in cash. I don't want your straw. But don't we say also if he's working for his friend and he also has to pay him? Didn't we learn didn't we have a price which we've already quoted several times in the last couple of Masechtos? We had it twice in our Masechta 76a and 111a. We said that if you hire a worker to work in some you hire a worker to work in your property and then you show him your friend's property, so that basically you have to pay the worker and then you could go collect the money. Then you could go collect the money from the other person. So basically, we see from here that he's like your employee. So therefore, we can't take that approach. So therefore, the Gemara is going to have to give an different answer. So, Amar Rav Nachman Lokasha Kam B'Shalo Kam B'Shal Hefker. So the Gemara says it's not a contradiction that between our Mishnah and the Brisa. Our Mishnah, which says that he has to be paid in cash, that's a case where he was collecting the money straight from the employer himself. But where he can be paid even in the straw, that's where he got it from, something that was hefker, so that was onerous. There he can get it straight. Then there he can get it collected in straw. So Gemara says Eisvei Revel Rav Nachman. So basically, Rava challenges this distinction Rav Nachman makes, because didn't we say in the next price, Metzias Pola Atzmo, that if a worker finds something, he's allowed to keep it. Emasai. When if the worker finds a lost object, is he allowed to keep it? When the employer says, basically, I want to hire you for a specific task of like weeding for me or digging for me. But if he says work for me the whole day, then it belongs to the employer if he finds a lost object. And so therefore, if he hires it to work on his behalf, then it's the straw should become the owner of the employer. And so therefore he can say, pay me in cash. I work for you. Oh, I'm not going to come back. Oh, so the distinction is that our Mishnah, which says you can't pay him in cash, that's basically that's where the worker was hired to pick up some straw and therefore acquire for the employer. So since he picked it up, it became the employer's, and the employer has to pay him in cash. But where he told him just watch it, so therefore, since he told him just to watch it, and so therefore, once the worker picked it up, he now acquired it, and so therefore, since he was watching it, he didn't acquire it, and so therefore, the employer doesn't have to pay him. Meaning to say, we have to go back a little bit, and we say that even though the worker was hired to acquire the straw on the employer's behalf, the straw does not become the property of the employer until the employer actually does a kinyan on it, a method of acquisition. And so therefore, since it's still ownerless, he can tell him to take it for himself. And so once he's done that, then it proves, Rashi says, that he was working for himself the whole time and he doesn't have to pay. It's a little bit tricky. I don't think we would buy it. But anyway, the basic point is just by watching it, you haven't acquired it. So therefore, the Gemara says, Rabba says, this idea of whether you acquire something by watching it is actually a dispute amongst the Tanaim, whether just by watching something you acquired it, because we learned in the Mishnah in Shkalim, chapter 4, Shomrei Svichei Shvius. So there were these growths that grew wild on Shvius, on the sabbatical year. You're technically speaking not allowed to watch them and to prevent anybody from taking them. But the Beis Hamikdash needed to do it in order to get the barley for the Omer offering and the wheat for the Shtei Alechem. So therefore, what do? Notlin Secharon Michumas Alishka. So therefore, what you do is you take the wages for them from the donation to the temple. Rabbi Yossi says, "Arotza misnadefu v'shomer chinam." So Rabbi Yossi says, no, if you want to volunteer for it, you're allowed to do that, and you're an unpaid watchman. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi says you don't have to be paid for it. And they said, Amalo Atal Merkin, if you say that they're not paid, then it's not coming from the communal offerings. Meaning to say, what does that mean? The Gemara says, what's the nature of the argument? If we can't come a savar, the Tanakh is saying, just by watching it, you're acquiring it. And so therefore, you have to pay them to show that they're not making a personal donation. Tanakh savar, how about the Bafkar Kani? Just by watching it, you've acquired it. Vihi avile agra in. And therefore, if you give him the money, then it's communal. Otherwise, it's not communal. Rabbi Yossi Savaras, Rabbi Yossi's in the position. How about the Behefker Lokani? Rabbi Yossi says just by watching it, you haven't acquired it. And therefore, when the community goes and brings it, he's then acquired it right now. When Rabbis, and this is what the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Yossi, what does it mean when they say that, and what does it mean when they say to Rabbi Yossi that then it's not coming from the community? This is what they're saying to me. If we apply your words to our words, that he doesn't need to be paid, and that watching it can affect the acquisition. Then it's not coming from the community because he's acquiring it for himself, and so therefore that's why we say our position. Rava says, no, I take a different approach. Rava says, the Kuli Alma about the Bafkar Kani. Everybody says by watching it, you acquire it. The reason why we pay them is because we're concerned that maybe he's not going to watch it properly. Give him money. Otherwise, we're worried he's not going to give it over completely to the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas Rabbi Yossi suffer, no, he makes a donation, he'll really properly make it. What does it mean when the Rabbanan say to Rabbi Yossi that if you say that the Omer and the Shtei Lechem will not come from the community? This is what they're saying. If we apply your words that he doesn't need to be paid with Varenu, our words that maybe he's not giving over properly, then ain't Omer Shtei Lechem by Mishalti. But that's not coming communal offerings. The Gemara has a third approach, which is a different way of Rava saying to what he said to Rabbi Yossi. Everybody says that Rava says that just watching it hasn't acquired it. We're worried about the people who are the Balei Zroos, who are going to come take it by force. The Tanakama is a position. The rabbi said that pay the watchman a little bit of money for Zuz, so that these hooligans will hear about it, and they'll know that we don't want to touch it. Rabbi Yossi the Rabbi Yossi said we don't make such a takana. And what is the upshot of that? That this is what they say. From your words according to our words, if we apply your words and it's not coming from the communal offering because we're paying them. This is the distinction between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanan, whether we have to be concerned about these Baal Yisrael to prevent them from coming, because according to Rabbi Yossi, who says we're not, then it's not coming from a communal offering. Okay, we're up to the next Mishnah. Hold on one second. Okay, says the next Mishnah. Hamoti Zevo Rishus Harabim. So somebody who takes out the manure into the public domain, then Hamotzi Motzi, meaning to say, Rashi says he's not allowed to leave it there, but the one who takes it out from his barn to the public domain, and the one who carries it, they have to be he's allowed to take it out, but the other person has to take it right away into his own property. Because we're worried that if it's left there, it'll cause damage. Now, mezabel, I'm somebody who fertilizes the ground, and so therefore, what happens is hamotzi zevel or rishus harabim, hamotzi. As soon as the one person takes it up, mezabel. The other person takes it away, and uses it right away. He's not supposed to leave it there. So too, ain't sure and tit per rishus harabim. You know how to steep the clay in the public domain. Basically, what they used to do, they would take the clay and soak it in water in order to make it appropriate for building. So, ain't sure and tit per rishus harabim, they ain't lovnim levanim. And you're not allowed to make bricks in the public domain. The way they would make the bricks was they would spread the clay over the ground, and then they would get it to basically do this in public. And so by making the bricks, it could be a nuisance to the public domain. But what you're allowed to do is you're allowed to knead the clay in the public domain. You can use the clay in public to use it like cement, but not for bricks. Because kneading the clay, that takes a little for bricks takes longer than for cement, and so therefore you could do it for cement, not for bricks. Somebody who's building in the public domain, or maybe avana maybe. So if somebody's building in the public domain, basically the workers need to use the public domain in order to be able to build. Then the one brings the stones, and vabona bona. As soon as the guy brings the stones, then you have to build right away. You can't leave them there. Rashi seems to say that you can't even put them down momentarily. And then the last line before we'll stop them, hizik, and if they cause damage, you're allowed to put it there, but if you cause damage, mishalim masha hizik, then you have to pay. You're even allowed to prepare your work for 30 days before you go there. You're allowed to set it up so before you use them. Okay, we'll stop here, and God willing, we'll do it again tonight at 7:20 p.m.
Thank you.